Picture this. It's July 28th, 1794. A rickety cart is rattling through the streets of Paris. Its grim passenger is the target of a jeering, screaming mob. The man's name is Maximilien Robespierre. Just days ago, he was the most powerful man in France, the de facto ruler of a nation in chaos, the architect of a revolution that had already consumed a king, a queen, and thousands of others. Today, his jaw is shattered, crudely bandaged after a failed suicide attempt. He's a prisoner, declared an outlaw by the very revolutionary government he helped create. As he's hauled toward the Place de la Révolution, the crowd's curses fill the air. He's about to meet his fate at the hands of the national razor, the guillotine, the same instrument he had used to purge France of its so-called enemies. The executioner rips away the blood-soaked bandage. A raw, animal scream of agony is torn from Robespierre's throat, a sound silenced only by the fall of the blade. The crowd erupts into thunderous, prolonged applause. So how did it come to this? This is the story of how a nation's cry for liberty, equality, and fraternity spiraled into the reign of terror and the rise of an emperor. How did a revolution born from the highest ideals of the Enlightenment descend into such a bloody spectacle? How did a movement for freedom end with the execution of its own leaders and the coronation of a new master? To understand, we have to go back to a world of glittering palaces and starving peasants, a world on the very brink of collapse. Act 1. The Old Regime and Rising Tensions. Before the Revolution, France was a kingdom of wild contradictions. It was the cultural heart of Europe, a beacon of philosophy and art, but it was also a society built on a foundation of profound and deeply resented inequality. This was the Ancien Regime, or the Old Regime, a system that had divided the French people for centuries into three rigid social classes known as estates. Think of it as a pyramid. At the very top, enjoying immense wealth and privilege, was the first estate, the clergy. They owned roughly 10% of the land in France and paid virtually no taxes. Just below them was the second estate, the nobility. These were the descendants of feudal lords, landowners who held the top jobs in the government and military. They too were almost entirely exempt from taxes. Together, these two estates made up less than 3% of the population. And at the bottom, holding up the entire structure, was the third estate. The third estate was, well, everyone else. It included wealthy merchants and lawyers, the bourgeoisie, who had money but no real political power. It included city laborers, craftsmen, and shopkeepers, and making up the vast majority, over 80% of the population, it included the peasants who worked the land, paying crushing dues to their noble landlords, a tithe to the church, and a whole battery of taxes to the king. The third estate had all of the burdens and none of the privileges. As one of its most influential voices, the Abbé Sieyès would famously write, "What is the third estate? Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it ask? To be something." Presiding over this fractured kingdom was a man completely ill-suited for the crisis to come, King Louis XVI. Louis wasn't a malicious tyrant. By many accounts, he was a well-meaning guy who wanted the best for his people. But he was also painfully indecisive, hated confrontation, and was easily swayed by the conservative nobles at his court. His queen, Marie Antoinette, daughter of the Austrian empress, became a symbol of the monarchy's extravagance and detachment. While her reputation for lavish spending was often exaggerated, she was deeply unpopular, nicknamed Madame Deficit, by a public that saw her as a foreigner meddling in French affairs and wasting the nation's money. And that money was draining away at an alarming rate. The French crown was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. This crisis was the result of decades of mismanagement and incredibly expensive wars. The biggest one was France's support for the American Revolution. While helping the American colonists fight for liberty was a great way to stick it to France's rival, Great Britain, it came at a staggering cost, adding over $1 billion to an already massive national debt. To solve the crisis, a series of finance ministers proposed the only logical solution: tax the privileged first and second estates. Men like Turgot, Jacques Necker, and Calonne all argued that the nobility and clergy had to pay their fair share. But these reforms were met with furious resistance from the elites, who used their power in the regional courts, the parliaments, to block any threat to their tax exemptions. The king, unable or unwilling to force the issue, repeatedly backed down. While the government was floundering, a different kind of revolution was already happening, a revolution of the mind. Throughout the 18th century, the ideas of the Enlightenment had swept across Europe, and France was its epicenter. Philosophers like Voltaire championed reason and challenged the authority of the Church. Montesquieu argued for a separation of powers to prevent tyranny, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau put forth the radical idea that sovereignty, the ultimate right to rule, didn't belong to a king, but to the people themselves. These ideas about liberty, rights, and equality began to chew away at the very foundations of absolute monarchy. Soldiers returning from the American War of Independence brought back stories of a republic founded on these exact principles, fanning the flames of change. The final ingredient was hunger. A series of terrible harvests in the 1780s, possibly linked to a volcanic eruption in Iceland, led to a critical grain shortage. For the average person in France, that meant one thing. The price of bread, the staple of their diet, went through the roof. At its peak in 1789, the cost of a single loaf of bread could eat up most of a laborer's daily wage. People were starving, and their desperation was turning to anger. Riots broke out across the country. The financial crisis had become a survival crisis, and the Third Estate, which had always carried the nation's financial burden, was now starving, while the privileged classes lived in luxury. Backed into a corner, with the treasury empty and the country in an uproar, Louis XVI made a fateful decision. For the first time in 175 years, he agreed to convene the Estates General, an old medieval assembly representing the three estates. It was a last-ditch effort to get support for new taxes, but in summoning the voices of the nation, the king wasn't opening a safety valve. He was lighting the fuse on a powder keg. Act 2. The Revolution and Reign of Terror. In May of 1789, the delegates of the three estates gathered at the Palace of Versailles. You could feel the anticipation in the air. History was about to be made. But the old divisions were immediately obvious. The Third Estate had over 600 representatives, outnumbering the other two estates combined. But according to the old rules, each estate voted as a single block. That meant the clergy and nobility could always outvote the Third Estate 2-1. The delegates of the Third Estate, many of them lawyers and intellectuals who had devoured Enlightenment texts, saw this for the trap it was. They refused to play a game they were guaranteed to lose. They demanded that all three estates meet as one body and vote by head, giving every delegate a vote. The king and the privileged orders said no. The standoff dragged on for weeks. Finally, on June 17th, the Third Estate made a truly revolutionary move. Led by figures like Abbé Sieyès, they declared themselves the National Assembly, boldly asserting that they, and they alone, represented the will of the French nation. They invited the other delegates to join them, but made it clear they would move forward with or without them. 3 days later, they arrived to find their meeting hall locked on the king's orders. Undeterred, the defiant delegates moved to a nearby indoor tennis court. There, in an incredible moment of unity, they swore the famous tennis court oath. They vowed not to separate until the constitution of the kingdom is established. This was a direct challenge to the king's authority. They weren't just subjects asking for reform anymore. They were a national body claiming the right to write the country's laws. As this political drama was playing out at Versailles, the mood in Paris, just 12 miles away, was getting ugly. Rumors were flying that the king was secretly gathering troops to crush the assembly. The last straw came on July 11th, when Louis fired his popular finance minister, Jacques Necker, who the people saw as their champion. To everyone in Paris, this looked like the beginning of an aristocratic coup. Panic and fury seized the city. Orators like Camille Desmoulins urged the people to arm themselves. On July 14th, 1789, a huge crowd of artisans and shopkeepers marched on the Bastille. This grim medieval fortress was a potent symbol of royal tyranny, a prison where political enemies were often held without trial. The mob wasn't really there to free prisoners. There were only 7 inside. They were there for the gunpowder stored inside, which they needed to defend the city. The prison governor refused to hand it over. His troops fired on the crowd, and a bloody battle began. After hours of fighting, the revolutionaries, now joined by mutinous soldiers, stormed the fortress. The governor was captured, killed, and his head was paraded through the streets on a pike. The fall of the Bastille was a political earthquake. It was a massive, symbolic victory of the people over the king's power. It proved that the revolution wasn't just a debate between well-dressed delegates anymore. It was a popular movement that could tear down the very symbols of the old regime. The king, stunned, was forced to back down. He pulled back the troops from Paris and reinstated Necker. But the revolution had entered a new, much more violent phase. News from Paris set the countryside on fire. Across France, peasants caught up in what became known as the Great Fear rose up against their feudal lords. Terrified that the aristocracy would take revenge, they armed themselves, burned manor houses, and destroyed the records of their feudal obligations. This massive rural uprising sent a clear signal to the National Assembly. The feudal system was done. On the night of August 4th, 1789, in a frenzied, emotional session, nobles and clergy rose one by one to give up their centuries-old privileges. Feudal dues, tax exemptions, and church tithes were all abolished. In a single night, the legal structure of the old regime was dismantled. One historian called it the death certificate of the old order. Building on this, on August 26th, the Assembly issued its most famous document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals and the American Declaration of Independence, it laid out the revolution's core principles. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights, the first article declared. It guaranteed rights to liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It proclaimed freedom of speech and religion and stated that sovereignty rests with the nation. It was a revolutionary blueprint for a new society based on individual rights and the power of the people. Yet, for all its soaring words, the Declaration didn't do much to solve the most urgent problem for most Parisians, the price of bread. By October, the king was still at Versailles, and he hadn't officially approved the August decrees or the Declaration. Many suspected he was stalling again, just waiting for a chance to crush the revolution. On October 5th, things reached a boiling point. A crowd of thousands, mostly market women from Paris, gathered to protest the constant bread shortages. Furious and armed with kitchen knives, pikes, and anything they could get their hands on, they began an incredible 12-mile march to Versailles in the pouring rain. They were going to take their complaints directly to the king. One eyewitness heard them yelling that men didn't have enough strength to avenge themselves, and that they would demonstrate that they were better than men. They stormed into the National Assembly, demanding bread. A small group was granted an audience with the king, who promised to distribute the palace's grain. But the crowd wasn't satisfied. The next morning, some of them broke into the palace itself, hunting for the hated queen, Marie Antoinette, who barely escaped. The royal bodyguards were overwhelmed and some were killed. To stop the violence, the king appeared before the mob and agreed to their final demand. The royal family would leave Versailles and return to Paris. The next day, a huge procession escorted the king, queen, and their son back to the capital, with the crowd chanting, "We have the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy. Now we shall have bread." Louis XVI was now basically a prisoner in his own capital, and the heart of the revolution moved for good from Versailles to Paris. Over the next 2 years, the National Assembly worked on a new constitution, aiming to create a constitutional monarchy. They seized church lands to back a new paper currency, the assignat, and put the Catholic Church under state control. This last move was deeply divisive and turned many devout Catholics against the revolution, creating a powerful counter-revolutionary movement. But the king himself had never really accepted his new job as a constitutional monarch. In June 1791, Louis, Marie Antoinette, and their children tried to flee France in disguise, hoping to get to the Austrian border and rally foreign armies to crush the revolution. But they were recognized in the town of Varennes and hauled back to Paris under guard. The flight to Varennes was a public relations disaster for the monarchy. It destroyed any remaining trust the people had in the king. Now he wasn't just a reluctant partner, he was a traitor. The escape attempt radicalized the revolution. Calls to get rid of the monarchy altogether grew louder. The political scene was now dominated by radical clubs, most famously the Jacobins, who demanded a republic. Meanwhile, the crowned heads of Europe, especially in Austria and Prussia, were watching with growing alarm, terrified the French plague of revolution would spread. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria, kicking off a conflict that would engulf Europe for over 20 years. The war started badly for France, and the losses fueled paranoia and accusations of treason against the king. On August 10, 1792, a radical mob stormed the Tuileries Palace, where the royal family was living. The king's Swiss guards were massacred, and the royal family had to run for safety to the Legislative Assembly. This insurrection was the effective end of the monarchy. The king was imprisoned, and a new, more radical government, the National Convention, was elected by universal male suffrage. The convention's first act on September 21, 1792, was to formally abolish the monarchy and declare France a republic. This happened right after the September massacres, a dark and brutal episode where panicked mobs, afraid of a Prussian invasion and an uprising of prisoners, dragged over 1,000 people from Paris's prisons and butchered them in the streets. The revolution had hit the point of no return. The big question now was what to do with the former king, now known simply as Citizen Louis Capet. Put on trial by the convention, he was found guilty of treason. The verdict was almost unanimous, but his sentence was fiercely debated. The radical faction, the Montagnards, led by figures like Maximilien Robespierre, demanded his death. The more moderate Girondins hesitated. In the end, the radicals won. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. He met his end with dignity, but his death sent shockwaves across Europe and shoved the revolution into its most extreme phase. The king's execution united a coalition of European powers against France. At home, the Republic was facing counter-revolutionary revolts, economic chaos, and a bitter power struggle between the Jacobins and Girondins. In this atmosphere of crisis and paranoia, the Jacobins seized control in June 1793. They created a powerful 12-man executive committee to deal with all the emergencies, the Committee of Public Safety. With Robespierre as its leading member, this committee would become the engine of the Reign of Terror. The terror was justified as a brutal but necessary measure to save the revolution from its enemies, both at home and abroad. Terror, Robespierre argued, is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. Under the new law of suspects, anyone could be arrested for being a counter-revolutionary on the flimsiest of evidence. A climate of fear settled over France. Neighbor denounced neighbor, and the revolutionary tribunals worked overtime, sending a steady stream of enemies of liberty to the guillotine. What began as a weapon against royalists and spies soon turned inward. Revolutionary leaders who dared to question the escalating violence were themselves consumed by it. Georges Danton, a charismatic speaker and one of the revolution's early heroes, called for moderation. For this, his former friend Robespierre accused him of being a traitor, and he was executed in April 1794. On his way to the scaffold, Danton reportedly shouted, "Show my head to the people, it is well worth seeing." The Terror was a time of intense ideological fever. The Jacobins tried to remake French society from the ground up, creating a new revolutionary calendar and promoting a deistic cult of the supreme being to replace Catholicism. But the endless bloodshed started to wear people down. The number of official executions reached around 17,000, with thousands more dying in prisons or in brutal massacres in the countryside. And as French armies finally started winning on the battlefield, the main justification for the terror as a wartime necessity began to look pretty thin. Robespierre, increasingly isolated and paranoid, saw conspiracies everywhere. On July 26, 1794, he gave a rambling speech to the convention, claiming he had a new list of traitors but refusing to name them. This was a fatal mistake. The terrified deputies, each fearing they would be next on the list, decided to act. The next day, the 9th of Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, they turned on him. When Robespierre tried to speak, he was drowned out by cries of, "Down with the tyrant!" The convention voted to arrest him and his closest allies. After a chaotic night where Robespierre was briefly freed and tried to rally his supporters, the convention's forces stormed the building where he was hiding. In the struggle, Robespierre's jaw was shattered by a pistol shot. Within hours, the man they called the Incorruptible, who had embodied the revolution's ruthless virtue, was condemned by the very system he'd created. His execution marked the end of the Reign of Terror. The revolution, having eaten so many of its own children, had finally turned on its most powerful father. Act 3. The Directory and Rise of Napoleon. The fall of Robespierre triggered what's known as the Thermidorian reaction, a major swing away from Jacobin radicalism. The survivors in the convention shut down the machinery of the terror, closed the Jacobin Club, and tried to set up a more stable, moderate government. The result, established in 1795, was the Directory. The Directory was specifically designed to prevent the kind of concentrated power that led to the terror. Executive power was split between 5 directors, chosen by a 2-house legislature. But from the very beginning, the Directory was weak and ineffective. It was a government of survivors that lacked a strong vision or popular support. It was constantly caught between threats from royalists on the right, who wanted to bring back the monarchy, and the remaining Jacobins on the left, who wanted to return to radical revolution. The government was notoriously corrupt. Politicians got rich while the country's economic problems got worse. The paper currency, the assignats, had become almost worthless, leading to runaway inflation and misery for ordinary people. The Directory's policies just weren't working, and it failed to win the public's trust. Disgusted by all the political infighting and instability, many French people just longed for order and a strong leader who could finally end the chaos. To stay in power, the Directory increasingly relied on the army to put down riots and scare its political opponents. This dependence on military force would be its downfall, because it made successful generals incredibly powerful and popular. And no general was more successful, more ambitious, or more popular than a young Corsican named Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had shot to fame during the Revolution, first as an artillery officer and later for dispersing a royalist mob in Paris with what he called a whiff of grape shot. His brilliant military campaigns in Italy in 1796 to 97 made him a national hero. He was a strategic genius, a charismatic leader, and a master propagandist who made sure his victories were celebrated all over France. A later campaign in Egypt didn't go as well, but when he returned to France in October 1799, he managed to spin it as a triumph. He came back to a country that was ripe for a takeover. The Directory was weaker and more unpopular than ever. One of the directors himself, Abbé Sieyès, the same guy who championed the Third Estate a decade earlier, was already plotting to overthrow the government from within. Sieyès thought a military coup was needed to create a more stable, authoritarian republic. He just needed a general to be the sword of his plan. He found his man in Napoleon. Napoleon, however, had no plans to be anyone's sword but his own. He saw the plot as his personal springboard to power. The coup was set for November 9, 1799, or 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar. The plan started by moving the legislative councils from Paris to a nearby palace, using the excuse of a fictional Jacobin plot. This got the deputies away from the city and surrounded them with Napoleon's loyal troops. Day 1 went fine. But on day 2, the whole thing nearly fell apart. When Napoleon entered the chamber of the Council of 500, he was met with a furious reception. The Jacobin deputies, realizing they were being couped, shouted, "Down with the dictator," and physically attacked him. For a moment, the famously decisive general completely lost his nerve. He was shoved, shaken, and reportedly almost fainted. The day was saved by his brother, Lucien Bonaparte, who happened to be the president of the council. Lucien ran outside, got the attention of the soldiers guarding the palace, and lied, claiming that assassins inside had tried to kill their general. He fired up the troops, who then marched into the chamber with bayonets fixed and cleared the room. Later that night, a handful of compliant legislators were rounded up to formally abolish the Directory and appoint 3 consuls to lead a new government: Sieyès, another plotter, and Napoleon Bonaparte. The coup was a success. The French Revolution was over, and it quickly became clear that the real power wasn't with 3 consuls, but with one, the first consul, Napoleon. A new constitution was written that cemented his authority, creating what was basically a military dictatorship. Exhausted by a decade of revolution, instability, and war, the French people largely went along with it, hoping for peace and order. As one of the plotters supposedly said, "Gentlemen, we now have a master." Conclusion: That was a whirlwind. In just 10 years, France went from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional one, to a radical republic, through a reign of terror, a period of corrupt moderation, and finally, to a military dictatorship that would soon become an empire. If you found this journey through one of history's most chaotic decades compelling, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories that shaped our world. Let us know in the comments which historical event you'd like us to tackle next. The legacy of the French Revolution is as messy and complicated as the event itself. It failed to create a stable democracy, instead clearing the path for an emperor. It was a time of unbelievable suffering, where the promise of liberty was often drowned out by the reality of the guillotine. But its impact was massive and permanent. It completely destroyed France's old social structure, wiping out feudalism and aristocratic privilege for good. The principles from the Declaration of the Rights of Man, liberty, equality before the law, and the sovereignty of the nation, became the foundation for modern democratic movements all over the world. It unleashed the powerful force of nationalism and proved that a determined people could overthrow a system that had lasted for centuries. The revolution's cry for liberty, equality, fraternity echoed across the globe, inspiring countless struggles for freedom that continue to this day. It was a chaotic, brutal, and transformative decade that, for all its contradictions, forever changed the course of history.